Welcome to the National Book Awards Campus Weekend at Concordia College. I'm Mark Creechy, Vice President for Academic Affairs, and I extend greetings to those here this evening, as well as those watching through our video production presented on the World Wide Web. I'm pleased to introduce the participants in tonight's reading and conversation session. First, National Book Award finalist in nonfiction, Alan Burdick. A finalist for his book Out of Eden, An Odyssey of Ecological Invasion, this work focuses on invasion ecology, chronicling the human acceleration of ecosystem transformation through the introduction of alien species. Burdick refers to this work as, quote, a travel book about the natural consequences about travel, unquote. Burdick is a senior editor at Discover magazine and has written on a range of scientific topics. Next, National Book Award finalist in nonfiction, Leo Damrosch. The Ernest Birnbaum Professor of Literature at Harvard University, Damrosch was a finalist for his biography, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Restless Genius. In this work, he chronicles Rousseau's life and the development of his philosophy, which resulted in one of the greatest works of political philosophy, The Social Contract, as well as his groundbreaking treatise on education, Emile. Harold Augenbraum is the executive director of the National Book Foundation. In addition to this role as executive director of the foundation, Mr. Augenbraum is well known for his scholarship on Latino literary studies. Our three guests are joined by Concordia College President Pamela Joliker. So before I turn the session over to President Joliker, why don't we once again welcome our guests.
With a question to Harold about the National Book Award. I had the privilege of talking to him when he first came on campus, and I learned something about this award, but I thought you would all like to know a little bit more about it, too. We know that it is one of the most prestigious awards in literature.
It's the most prestigious award.
The most prestigious award. Well, you've already answered my first question. My first question was, could you tell us something about its place among the top literary awards in the country? You've answered that one. How about the process by which finalists and winners are selected?
I'm all kidding aside, the idea that it's the most prestigious award in the United States. There are a couple of other awards that are selected differently: the Pulitzer, the National Book Critics Circle Award, and the PEN/Faulkner Award for fiction. In particular, also three other great awards that are national awards, like the National Book Award. What makes the National Book Award different from these other awards is the process by which the awards are selected. In the first place, we start actually in January. The awards are given out in November, but we start in January. And we ask 550 writers across the country to nominate potential judges. Now, judges have to be writers who write in that genre. We have 4 genres: fiction, nonfiction, young people's literature, and poetry. So they generally, in the past few years, have nominated as many as 400 judges for those 4 panels of 5. We then go through those nominations, and we try and get a diverse panel. That means diverse of geography and race and writing style, male, female. So we have different voices on the panel for all of the awards. By the middle of March, as a matter of fact, just the day before yesterday, we constitute the panels, and I recruit them and put the panels together. That is the last bit of influence I have on the National Book Awards. The panels then are completely independent from that time on. The panelists themselves, the panel gets together at the beginning of May by conference call, and they decide on the process that they're going to use, on the criteria that they're going to use, and the schedule that they're going to have. And they don't discuss that with us at all unless they have problems or they want some advice. They sometimes talk to early judges who have been there in the past, and panel chairs from the past, so they figure out exactly how they want to do it. But they're completely independent. During the summer, as they're reading the books, they have conference calls, and again, we don't take any part in those conference calls at all. They're totally independent. By the beginning of September, they've decided to cut the number of books down to 30 or 40. By the beginning of October, they have the 5 finalists, and then they get together at a really nice restaurant in Manhattan. This is one of their perks, and believe me, when you get the bill, you can actually see what kind of restaurant it is. On the day of the National Book Awards, they get together, and of the 5 finalists, these 5 judges select the National Book Award winner for that year. And they don't tell anybody, and as a matter of fact, they can't tell anybody until it's announced from the stage that evening. So even we don't know. So we sit there, and the panel chair gets up and announces the 5 nominees that night at the New York Marriott Marquis, and tells the whole world who the National Book Award winner is. And sometimes it's surprising to us. And one just hopes that the camera's not on one of us when the jaw drops and it's someone we don't really know. Last year, of the 4 categories, 1,200 books were nominated. They're all nominated by publishers. 175 in young people's literature, 175 in poetry, 275 in fiction. And remember, all the judges are required to read all of the books. And in nonfiction, and both Alan and Leo were in the nonfiction category, there were 542 books nominated. The judges have about 3 months to read these 542 books. And as I was saying to some of the students that we were talking to this afternoon, that means that they have to read a lot of pages. Now, 542 books, at the end of this, after all the judging was over, one of the judges called me and said, you know, I think you owe me a new pair of contact lenses. Then another one called me and said, I want a trip to the Caribbean. Finally, a third one called and said, I want a new car. And I said, what does this have to do with the judging? He said, I don't know, I needed to ask, that's all. So it really is, you know, these judges put in a lot of time and a lot of effort, and it's a difficult task for them, but I think what it comes out with is some of the best books that have been written in the United States that year. And it's used for a variety of different purposes, and I think we're going to talk about in a minute what happens when these finalists are selected, and when I call them the day before they're announced publicly, they can't tell anybody for 24 hours until it's announced publicly. So I think we're going to talk about that afterwards.
Well, and that's my next question. What was it like to get the call? Did you have any idea that the second Tuesday of October was a date you should be paying any attention to?
No, I really had no idea. And one day I'm at the office and this guy named Harold Augenbraum calls, and he's talking about something about John Grisham. He's going to say my name on the steps of Faulkner's Mansion, and somehow I'm processing that I should really be reacting to this news, and I'm sort of stalling for time, saying, "Wow, that's great, you know, that's really an honor." Meanwhile, I'm trying to figure out what I actually feel, and so I hang up, and he says, you know, he said, "Don't tell anybody." So of course, I immediately call my wife, and at which point she bursts into tears. And that was really the point at which it hit me. And later we talked about it, and I said, you know what, there really was this kind of catharsis that we both felt at the news, but what was that really about? And I thought about it, and I said, you know, it's sort of like we've been on this desert island. I mean, I've been writing this book for 10 years, and she's known me for 5 of them, so she's always known me as this guy who's been writing this book about what, you know, will it ever end? And, you know, it's like we're on a desert island, and one day a little plane flies over, and then it circles around. And it's, you know, they've seen us. But, you know, we put our, you know, as a writer, you sort of put yourself on that desert island. So it's a mixed feeling of excitement of being recognized, but also, you know, you were never really in it for the recognition to begin with. So it's, you almost don't want to allow yourself to be excited about it, if you know what I mean.
Well, my experience is very similar indeed to Alan's, though I would add, since Harold called me out of the blue, I happened to be in my study at the university where I teach, happened to answer the phone, had the same difficulty processing the information I was receiving, but being told I couldn't reveal this to anyone, though I did, of course, immediately call my wife. I really had a sinking feeling that it was a cruel hoax, and it might never turn out to be true because it was, it was written on air, and only when I could see documentation was I quite sure it had happened. But I also had taken 10 years on this and had been married to my wife for all of those 10 years, and definitely you're not even quite sure you got the thing done and that it's real, and to be told that other people have actually read it and liked it was more of a surprise than you would think.
Do you know if you tell anybody, you forfeit the?
How has it affected your life since? What's like life now after the announcement?
Well, now when I tell my wife that I'm thinking about writing another book, she doesn't have that look of shock on her face. Not that it, not that the next book I think will put me in this category again. But I just think being in the wilderness for that long with this subject matter, it is really more of a personal validation than anything. I mean, the sticker goes on the paperback, and people will now say, oh, National Book Award finalist Alan Burdick, and that really does help your writing career from here on in. But in a way, I'm trying to kind of keep that as just sort of noise in the background, and just focus on the next phase.
Yeah, it obviously has practical advantages and consequences, but I don't know how it affects your life. Somebody did an experiment showing that if you win the lottery, after about 3 months, you're exactly the way you were before. That your temperamental level always gets back where it had been. I know that when Samuel Beckett, who wrote Waiting for Godot, won the Nobel Prize, he was traveling in Africa, and the news couldn't reach him until a reporter found him and said, "You have won the Nobel Prize. How do you feel?" And Beckett said, "Depressed."
Well, Alan, this is your first book, and Leo, this is your first book that's not been written for an academic press. And your work, Alan, has been mainly for magazines. You've been a journalist.
That's right.
So can you talk to us a bit about the writing process and how writing this book, over 10 years, was different from producing a magazine piece?
Well, it was really a huge challenge and a huge learning process for me. I was in writing magazine pieces for maybe 10 years before I started on this book project, and magazine pieces are of a certain fairly short length, and they have a certain rhythm to them, and there's a certain just kind of style of, you say what you're going to say, and then you say it, and then you tell the reader again what you've said. And when I sat down to write the first chapter of this book years and years and years ago, I sort of blew right through it, and I'd suddenly written a longer chapter than any magazine piece that I had ever written, and at which point I realized, I'm running the marathon now. I'm not running, I'm not running the 400-meter dash, and it really forced me to slow down and almost learn to write all over again. And then the particularly hard part was that by the time I got to the last chapter, several years later, I then went back and started revising and looked at the first chapter and realized that I had changed so much as a writer in that period of time that it was as if some other person had written the beginning of the book. Stylistically, and also I knew so much more about my subject at the end that I then had to go back to the beginning and completely rewrite the first third of the book to make it match the person that I was then at the end.
Well, you had practice writing books, but you were not writing an academic book.
Yeah,
this
and I
time.
think maybe my experience is almost the opposite. It was exhilarating and liberating to write for just an intelligent, interested reader who was not a specialist and not a rival and wasn't going to review it viciously because it made them look better. So the writing was the easy part. It took 10 years because there was so much reading to do. There are 50 volumes of letters by Rousseau or to Rousseau, heavily annotated, full of information. There are 10,000 pages of work that he actually published. There's all kinds of stuff by people who knew him, and this, you could go on forever and never write the book. But when I came to write it, it was exciting because I could just tell a story. And if something was boring or unimportant, I could leave it out. It's just the opposite with academic writing.
And I'm curious what kind of a reaction you've gotten from your more academic colleagues.
Essentially, they don't know it exists. I mean, my
Seriously.
immediate colleagues do, my friends in my own university do, but I suppose eventually they will. But biography is rather looked down on. It's cheap and easy and popular and not like really proving something important.
How were you each attracted to your topics?
Well, I suppose I was attracted to, I mean, this is a book that spends a lot of time with biologists in the field and all sorts of exotic locations in Hawaii and Australia, and I was certainly drawn to that adventure part of it. But a central biological figure in this book is this brown tree snake that's originally from Australia and made its way to Guam after the Second World War and ate pretty much all the birds on the island. And in the last 20 years, it's begun making its way to Hawaii, among other places, by crawling into the wheel wells of airplanes and dropping out at the airport. And, you know, there was something about this snake that I really found quite admirable. And often when we talk about alien species, we really just talk about them in terms of the negative effects, which are many. But I did feel like there was advantage in identifying with them at a certain degree, and I was interested in the idea that you know, it was my ability to get on an airplane and go to Guam and go to Hawaii in a matter of hours that made the spread of the snake and other organisms like it possible. So I felt like we were joined in some kind of a crime. You know, if this was going to be a crime novel, the narrator was going to be somehow complicit in the crime, and the idea of writing a book from that point of view very much intrigued me.
I've had an extremely conventional academic career. I've been in school my whole life. I went from college to graduate school to teaching. And I think I've been drawn to people who were more like outsiders and had a completely different, challenging perspective because they were so different from me. So I spent years at one time working on William Blake, whom I still honor as a prodigious genius. But like Rousseau, someone who never went to school for a single day and was self-taught in the best sense because he was thinking things through for himself. And when I began teaching some of Rousseau's works, when I was totally inexpert in them, I just got more and more drawn to the remarkable way his life experience seemed to be expressed in his thinking. It wasn't abstract arguments to score a point. He was really living on the page. And then I noticed there wasn't a decent biography. The only one in English was 3 volumes long and incredibly pedestrian and very unimaginative. And I thought maybe I could actually do this. And for a while I thought I must be kidding myself because I'm not in French literature and never written a biography, but it became first a hobby and then a kind of passion that was the most fun thing I ever did.
Well, Alan, why don't we ask you to give us a reading from
Oh, sure,
your
okay.
book. Thanks.
I guess I'll just preface this. Oh, sure, hang on. Sorry. I'll preface this by saying, you know, I spent a lot of time initially with snakes and birds, and really the more time that I began to spend with these biologists, the more I really gravitated towards the scientists who were examining microscopic stuff and realizing that often when we talk about biodiversity, we're talking about, or at least when we talk about it in the newspapers, we're talking about, you know, big charismatic megafauna and the loss of, you know, the big beautiful things that we can really easily visualize. But so much of biodiversity out there is stuff that is really small, that we don't think about, and that for the most part scientists aren't even studying. And that for me was really was the lost world. And well, that is very much what this segment is about. There's a hole in the earth, a vent in the seabed, a volcano. It erupts and erupts, magma oozes up, a red fuse rising onward, upward, at last, after eons blossoming above the waves. An island, the Big Island, the youngest island in the archipelago called Hawaii. On occasion, lava breaks through a wall of Kilauea crater, or issues from one of the smaller craters around it, and makes a run for the sea. Often enough, this happens in plain sight, and it is entirely unstoppable. Everything is plowed under, swaths of forest, stretches of pristine beach, even, as happened in 1989 along the Kalapana coast 30 miles downhill from Kilauea, expensive houses with ocean views. It's common enough these days to read about nature giving way to culture, of a stretch of marshland, say, lost as bulldozers and tar spreaders prepare the ground for a housing development or a chain bookstore. Rarely do you hear of the converse, civilization paved under to make way for some trees. Yet that's exactly what happened. The residents of Kalapana could only watch as the lava inched closer each day like an assault of red-hot snails, sending trees into flame, engulfing a park visitors center, creeping across $1 million roadway, and one by one reducing homes to carbon ash. I watched it all years later on a local television station devoted exclusively to footage of advancing lava flows as the narrator spoke ominously of the goddess Pele exacting her revenge. Yet the flow of lava is not always above ground nor visible. Consider a stream of lava, notably of the highly fluid basaltic variety known as pahoehoe. It runs downhill, following the contours of the earth into gullies and natural channels. Gradually, the sides of the stream cool, congeal, harden. The active lava runs now like a brisk river through a narrowing canyon. The surface of the river may cool and harden too, crusting into a thick roof. And still the lava advances, molten blood churning now through a roughly cylindrical tube several or a dozen feet below ground. When the flow ceases and the lava drains, a tunnel remains, its walls fused to a black glaze by the combustion of volcanic gases. With new eruptions in subsequent months, years, or centuries, new tubes may intersect and infuse old ones or cut them short, crossing and recrossing, interweaving, forming an interrupted plexus of hardened, emptied arteries, interconnected further by restless capillary crevices that open and close as the lava field cools, cracks, settles, ages, and erodes. To venture into a lava tube, then, is to enter into the circulatory system of the Earth itself, or, it often seemed to me, the Jurassic pathway of some giant rock-eating earthworm. Some lava tubes extend for hundreds of yards before breaking into skylight, others for 1,000. Some, like the Thurston lava tube, not far from the headquarters of Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, are large enough to permit tourists to stroll through two abreast. Many more lace beneath long, overgrown lava fields in forgotten corners of Hawaii, and they are as cramped as a crawl space or narrower. Certainly no place, one might easily assume, for an explorer of Frank Howarth's bulk. Howarth is an entomologist at the Bishop Museum in Honolulu, where he holds the L.A. Bishop Chair in Zoology. Although the position is distinguished, the accommodations are burrow-like. Howarth occupies the last in a row of makeshift cubicles, each separated from the next by walls of steel bookshelves stacked with dusty journals and jars of pallid creatures steeped in formaldehyde. He is large, with burly forearms laced with scratches, earned in search of this endangered damselfly or that yellow-faced bee. A dense white beard merges into a shock of silver hair atop his head. His glasses, thick with plastic rims, are affixed to his head with a wide rubber band strap. Howarth's specialty is lava tubes and the strange array of insects that inhabit them: albino cave moths, albino plant hoppers, pale crickets, and earwigs, most of them blind, having evolved in near or total darkness. They are descended from insects often still living above ground. The big-eyed hunting spider, found outdoors on mountain summits, in young lava flows, and in forests, has two cousins relegated to the caves: the small-eyed, big-eyed hunting spider and the no-eyed, big-eyed hunting spider. Howarth has discovered more than 50 different species of lava tube insects in Hawaii so far, although, as he quickly insists, he merely finds them. The real work of identifying a new species is performed by the taxonomist he often sends them to, whose task involves counting tiny hairs on tiny legs and deciphering even tinier genitalia. Howarth is constantly exploring old caves and looking for new ones. He studies a map of the lava flows, locates a likely area, goes there and stumbles around until he sees a promising vent in the earth. He straps on knee pads, slips on gloves, dons a hard hat with a miner's lamp. Ah, wild caving at its best, he'll say, and crawl in. Typically, the floor is level and the ceiling is low. If Howarth has chosen well, delicate strands of roots hang from roof to floor in curtains. The ohia trees, the first native plants to colonize a fresh lava field, send their roots dozens of feet deep in search of water. The roots are the life threads of the cave, the fundamental source of moisture and nutrients. The larvae of the cave moth and the nymphs of the plant hopper, a white fleck of an insect, feed primarily on them. The other inhabitants feed on these insects or their debris. It is an ephemeral environment. Older lava fields are dominated by koa, soapberry, and other trees, whose roots do not extend below the blankets of soil accumulating there. For this reason, cave-adapted insects are limited almost exclusively to younger lava tubes. In one 500-year-old tube near Kilauea, Howarth found 11 species of cave-adapted arthropods and insects. In another, only 100 years old, 7 species had already settled. In fact, insects rarely inhabit the caves proper. They spend most of their lives in the interstitial cracks and voids, venturing into a new cave only when the conditions, high temperature, high humidity, a stable air mass, are right. Howarth crawls through a lava tube with meticulous grace of a bear in a blueberry patch. He makes a point of not breaking roots, or, to the extent that this is possible, even brushing them. A plant hopper nymph knocked from its edible perch could well starve. Trampling a visible root can kill the 50 additional feet of it that continue down through the rock, thus removing it from the food chain. Accordingly, Howarth does not like the notion of visitors in the caves. People leave trash, write graffiti, and exhale cigarette smoke, which in enclosed spaces acts as a powerful insecticide. Even informed visitors draw his skepticism. Once, Howarth rounded a corner to discover that his companion, a local conservationist and an astute field biologist, had written the word shit in a small patch of white cave slime. To Howarth's subsequent lecture, the fellow replied that he merely had been marking the location of a small pile of rat droppings occupied by some intriguing insects. Both of his arguments were patently false, of course, Howarth later wrote in a paper on cave conservation, and after some consideration I erased the word, even though it virtually destroyed the remains of a rather nice patch of slime and its inhabitants. Howarth is presented with the ecological equivalent of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Publicizing the existence of the lava tube ecosystem will surely attract curiosity seekers and bumbling explorers. Remaining silent ensures that the caves will continue to be paved over, chewed up by developers, destroyed in ignorance. Even in his scientific papers, Howarth is cagey. He describes roughly where his caves are, but never exactly. Although Howarth loves all his lava tube insects equally, he has a soft spot for the plant hoppers because, as he has discovered, they sing. He traces the roots of this insight back to 1949 and the work of the Swedish entomologist Frey Ossian Nilsson. With a simple set of tools, Ossiah Nilsson demonstrated that some 80 local species of the suborder Achenorhyncha, which includes leafhoppers, plant hoppers, and various other insects not much larger than the typewritten letter I, produce an astounding array of sounds. But you must listen closely. The first song Ossiah Nilsson heard was emitted by Aphrodis bifasciatus, a leafhopper. He had put the insect in a small glass vial and held the opened end to his ear. By this method, I have heard most of the calls described in this paper, and several species caught during my travels I have been able to study in this way only. Sometimes, to facilitate observation, Ossiah Nilsson would watch in a mirror as his subjects sang into his ear. Yet other calls were strong enough that they could be heard distinctly if the insect was placed on a suitable sounding board. In most cases, he used for this purpose the belly of his violin. It was as though Ossiah Nilsson had wandered into a microcosmic concert hall, a veritable subsonic symphony. Each species of insect had its own call, as unique as a songbird's. Ossiah Nilsson got hold of a microphone and amplifier and made gramophone recordings. From the Royal Telegraph Society, he borrowed a radiograph to measure the frequency of the rhythms. Limited only by the written language, he set out to describe what he heard. Dicranotropus hamata. I listened to the sound production of this species on 22 June 1945 at 5:35 p.m. Cluckings pitched in about C1, emitted singly or in an irregular rapid succession, are often heard. These calls sound like a plucking on rubber strings or a rapping on hollow wood. Sometimes a dull boo or burr pitched in G1 are heard. The latter sound lasts for 2 or 3 seconds. I heard these calls even in the dark on 23 June 1945 at 5 minutes past midnight. Dying yell of the male, a short buzz pitched in F1. Caligipona elegantula. The song was rather faint. It began with a couple of short croaking notes, cha-cha, followed by a rhythmical buzzing as from a sewing machine. This song lasts for about 10 seconds. Through his binocular magnifier, Ossiah Nilsson deciphered the musical mechanics of his subjects. Orthopteran insects, crickets, katydids, locusts, and grasshoppers, generate sound by rubbing the edge of one forewing against another or against a leg. They are the string section of the insect orchestra. Ossiah Nilsson's subjects operated differently. They produce sound by vibrating their abdomens, as a tin can might sound if it were rapidly scrunched and unscrunched. Cicadas, larger cousins of the leafhoppers, sing in this way. In addition, the vibration of the body was often accompanied by a regular stamping of the insect's feet. In this sense, their song is more properly a drumming. Ossiah Nilsson compared it to Morse code, and as he soon discerned, it is a code with a purpose. With species after species, Ossiah Nilsson beheld complex and musically furious mating rituals. During the singing, the abdomen vibrated vertically, he noted after watching a pair of Euplex depressa through his binocular magnifier. Soon this vibration became rather strong and set the whole body in such agitated motion that the male was forced to shift his foothold once a second and pace with the music. In this way, a sort of dance or marking time was executed, interrupted, however, now and then by short, rapid movements in the direction of the female. The latter often tried to escape by running or by a leap. Sometimes the male made a short pause in his music, but recommenced it if he found himself near the female. Frank Howarth surmised that something similar might be going on among his own lava tube plant hoppers. Sure enough, experiments that he and a colleague conducted with a soundboard, not a violin, but a small balsa wood box attached to a sensitive microphone and amplifier, revealed a rich suite of songs. The call of each species, he determined, is unique. The cave-dwelling plant hopper Olearis loreti is named in honor of country star Loretta Lynn, on whose property and in whose spelunking company Howarth found it. In fact, when Howarth played back mating calls of the plant hopper Olearis polyphemus, which is found in 7 caves on the Big Island, he heard 7 slightly different dialects of song, each native to one of the caves. Each population was musically isolated, a separate sonic island. They sounded like seven separate species, in effect, and indeed may be. After some detailed peeping, Howarth found distinct, if barely perceptible, physiological differences between them. To breed successfully, Potential mates of the same species must first recognize each other. For insects, as for birds, a song is one means of attraction. For eyeless insects living in total darkness, the song is the only means. But there are acoustics to overcome. The cicada is audible because he is large. His song is sufficiently strong to vibrate air molecules for a mile around. Pity the tiny plant hopper and her faint tremblings, too weak to vibrate the air. Howarth wondered, how does the male hear her? And how, having heard her song through the dark, does he find her? In the 1970s, it was shown that above-ground plant hoppers transmit their signals not through the air, but through the ground, more precisely through their host plant, the stems of grass they spend most of their lives standing on and feeding from. For the lava tube plant hoppers, the medium is the roots of the native ohia tree. Howarth has found that the songs of subterranean plant hoppers can travel through roots for more than 2 meters, about the distance in human scale of a crosstown phone call. Songs can even travel between roots via the hair-sized rootlets that cross and touch the main lines without the message seriously degrading. When Howarth enters a lava tube, then, he sees a web of telegraphy. The lines around him are inaudibly electric, thrumming, whirring, buzzing. He is Horton hearing a who. And the who's, he says, are getting harder and harder to hear for the simple reason that the roots are disappearing. The ohia trees are losing ground. Once among the first plants to colonize fresh lava fields, they now are being displaced by Myricophyia, a foreign tree accidentally introduced from the Azores that germinates sooner, spreads more rapidly, and is crowding out the native trees. And the roots of Myricophyia do not penetrate into the caves below and dangle free, nor are they edible to plant hoppers. The wires are dead. The song lines are fading. The singers are growing mute, each one marooned on the island of itself, unable to communicate, to mate, to sustain its end of the evolutionary conversation. When I was a child, my family owned a recording of the poems of Dylan Thomas, read by Thomas himself. His voice haunts me now. The force that through the green fuse drives the flower, drives my green age, that blasts the roots of trees is my destroyer. Thank you.
Alan, one thing that makes your book so interesting to me is that it takes a distinct point of view. And it is this, you both report about the topic, but you insert yourself into the story as a reporter. What was it about your material or the way you thought about it that led you to approach it that way?
Well, it sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier about the brown tree snake and feeling like this was this is a problem that the movement of alien species around the world that I participate in, that we all participate in, often without even really thinking about it, and often simply as a function of moving around the world. And here are these organisms moving around the world themselves, being somewhat opportunistic, much as we move around the world and are opportunistic. So I felt that it was important that I go into this subject, again, kind of identifying with these organisms at a certain level. And in that way, I felt that using the first person was not only appropriate, but kind of essential. But at the same time, I had such great characters and such great organisms that it was really a constant battle to not let the first person get in the way. Really, I had to really work to sort of set it up in the beginning and then just step back and not really step in any more than necessary.
You say of your book that it's a parable, both cautionary and celebratory. Could you explain that?
Yeah, what did I mean?
Right. It sounded good at the time.
Very mysterious. Very good book proposal language. Well, I guess what I meant was, again, I kind of went into this having read a number of books about alien species, and a number have come out in recent years, all taking a sort of a similar line, and that is, we're going to give you example after example and tell you how bad it is, and again, not to undercut the implications of this problem. I really felt like, just tone-wise, that kind of parable, stepping back tone was really kind of necessary here. And it was, both a travelogue in terms of my, a document of my travels through this world, but also a document of the travels of these other organisms around the world. And I wanted those two narratives to constantly speak with each other.
Well, Leo, your biography of Rousseau is quite different in approach. For one thing, your subject wasn't available to be interviewed or observed. But how did you decide how to approach the subject and all of that material that you had available to you?
I don't know if I ever decided in as clear a way as that would imply. Indeed, one problem, though, for a biographer is in how much to express opinions and attitudes. And I was quite startled that several reviews of the book have said I'm not judgmental enough. I don't condemn him as severely as I should when he does something wrong, which seemed kind of weird to me. I thought the biographer is trying to understand and explain, not score points off a dead person. But I guess you cannot work on somebody for that long without getting invested in them and identifying in some sense with them and feeling like they're speaking to you and you're trying to understand them. So that definitely happens, and you want to watch out that you're not writing a novel about them instead of really making sense of their life.
You said before that you had just an abundance of material and that you felt kind of liberated in that you were writing a biography, not an academic piece, and so you could choose to leave out boring material, for example. Well, how did you make that choice? How did you ultimately decide what to keep in and what to leave out of that story?
Well, some things can't be left out because if it happened to him, you have to acknowledge it, but you can find a way to say it in a phrase or a sentence or some throwaway allusion. You don't have to name everybody he ran into, and the reader will never hear of that person again, and they're trying to keep it all straight. But often it was true. I would tell some episode at some length because I'd spent so long getting to understand it, and there the crucial filter was my wife, who would say, these 10 pages don't belong in here. And she was always right. You'd think, gosh, I could say that in one sentence and take it out again. So there's no right way. It's more a sense of proportion and pace, and you want it to feel like a story.
Mm-hmm. What were the reviews like?
So far, there haven't been many. They've been basically generous, but it's curious. Rousseau was a sort of difficult and challenging character, and everybody who has reviewed the book seems to already know what they think about Rousseau. So it's curious to what extent they're arguing with him and forgetting that they're reviewing a biography at all.
How about yours, Alan?
I mean, generally generous, but actually the criticisms have been in a funny way that I have not been judgmental enough, that I haven't come out and condemned, alien species as the worst environmental problem since sliced bread, and again, not to undercut that, but that just wasn't what the book was intended to do. It was really meant to be much more kind of a documentary of biologists working in the field and trying to understand how they extract information from nature, as one of them put it to me, and I just felt like the whole point was to not judge, but that apparently is not kosher.
Harold, I have a question for you. These books do get reviewed, some of them, before they become candidates for the National Book Award. Do you have a sense of the influence of reviews on the award process itself, or the readers?
Well, one thing was interesting about that, that both of them said that the critics have said they're not judgmental enough, which sort of leads me to believe that the panel itself seemed to have made a decision that they were not looking for books that were judgmental. And I would look at the other three books, which I will do when I go back, and see if they were judgmental enough and whether the panel actually had that without realizing it within them. They are writers themselves. And there's a certain collegiality, I think, that may come from that critics may not feel when they're reviewing, that they feel that they've got to say that the writers themselves, the colleagues that you have in the writing field, might have felt that it wasn't necessary to be judgmental, and that might have been part of the criteria that they decided upon. As for reviews, it's really kind of interesting, reviews beforehand and reviews afterwards. A lot of the judges we use are also regular review writers. So, but they tell us that they're not influenced by reviews, and as a matter of fact, probably the most controversial of the awards is the fiction award, and many fiction writers also write reviews, and but it tends to be a very New York-centric controversy when there's a controversy. And we found out this year, because of the fiction award winner, from the judges afterwards, that even though there was a handicapping that was going on in New York Magazine, that they put odds on the 5 fiction and who was going to win. And of course, the 10-to-1 shot was the long shot, and the 10-to-1 shot won. Then we realized afterwards that all the buzz that happens in New York publishing circles and all the buzz in the magazines never gets to the judges, because the judges are generally not from New York. And they're not reading New York Magazine, and they're not reading the New Yorker, and not reading the New York Times. They're just simply reading the books. So they don't, buzz doesn't really matter to them at all, because I asked them afterwards, and they said, huh? What are you talking about? We never heard that. Except for one.
Well, yeah.
So.
You want to?
Which one it is?
Yes.
I can't tell you.
Okay.
Everything in the National Book Awards is confidential, and this is one of those situations. If I told you, I'd have to kill everybody out here.
Oh, we wouldn't want that. To a certain extent, there's some interesting similarities or commonalities in these two books, which are so very different in many ways. But to a certain extent, they're both biographies. Leo's is quite obviously that, because it looks deeply into the life and the psyche of one very well-known person. But Alan's is a very personal odyssey, but you have many characters that you're including in that story. I want to give you a quote, which I got from Harold, from the judges' citations for both books. Rousseau renders one of the most canonical figures in Western literary and political thought into a full-bodied human, flawed, glorious, searching, and bold. Alan Burdick draws memorable portraits of the scientists, hunters, and activists struggling to address the economic, political, and biological implications of this homogenization of the world. Well, since both books focus on the personalities of the people involved, how do you get under the skin of your subjects, as Leo again has the more challenging job there? How do you get under the skin of that subject? And then, how do you keep from or projecting your own self into those subjects?
Well, I had, in my case, the huge advantage, but also possible obstacle that Rousseau wrote a brilliant autobiography. And in fact, I'll read a little bit of my account of it in a short while. He was the first person in the history of the world to write at great length about his childhood and earliest years, and to consider them as formative. But it means we don't have much evidence except what he tells us, and he wrote it down years afterward, and even if he was trying to tell the truth, he must have seen it in hindsight. And then, as you say, I'm writing 200 years later in a completely different world. I must be, to some extent, inventing Rousseau. But I think that's how we understand even the people we know best. We're always creating them in our own imagination, and I think you just have to live with that.
I'm actually curious, Leo, were you ever, I mean, given Rousseau's emphasis on autobiography and you know, exploring the inner self. Were you ever tempted to write in the first person, or did you find yourself forming a kind of a, you know, first person bond with Rousseau at a certain level?
Oh, I think I've formed the bond, but there is a fashion nowadays for a biography that's really my quest for my subject, which I find kind of narcissistic, and I'm old-fashioned enough to think I ought to be sort of in the background presenting Rousseau rather than emphasizing my own, you know, struggles.
What about your subjects?
I mean, I guess I practice a kind of journalism that a couple other friends of mine and I who do this call hang-around journalism. And it's basically where you find a character or a group of characters that you like and whose company you like, and people who don't really seem to mind your presence. And then you just start hanging around them. And you know, you're keeping a notebook, or at least for a while I was using a tape recorder to record them, but I began spending so much time with them that I couldn't stand to listen to all those transcripts. So I just kept a notebook, and pretty much you start to blend into the woodwork. And you know, and from a writer's point of view, from a reporter's point of view, that's very satisfying. But it is also a little scary, because you know at that point that you know, you're still working, and they've forgotten that you're working, and you know, that's the point when you really have somebody's career and reputation in your hands, and have to be very careful about, you know, not hanging them out to dry, not, you know, picking the most you know, egregious or spectacular quote and letting it stand for them.
Well, what's next for you each?
I really don't know, because I spent so long on that, and in some ways am both relieved to be done and bereaved because it's not still there, that I thought I'd better take a little time before I jump into the next thing. So I've got various thoughts, but I don't want to jump yet.
Are you inclined to do another commercial book?
Oh, it's a heady thought, but I don't have the subject for it yet.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you could go back to academic publishing, or...
No, never.
Alan, are you tempted to do academic publishing?
I mean, a year ago I would have said, a year ago I did tell myself I will never write another book. It was just too grueling, and the whole publishing experience is not really all that fun. But a year later I managed to forget what I said. And
It's like childbirth.
I'm actually thinking of writing a book about time, in part because this book took so long that partly I want to write a book, I want to write a shorter book in a discrete amount of time, but I am also simultaneously interested with what time is, not so much in a kind of a cosmic Einsteinian sense, but more in a kind of Augustinian sense. You know, where does time come from? What does it pass through? Where does it go? The science, the neuroscience of time now, and how the brain deals with time is fascinating. And of course, there's huge industry in time management and attention science, and you know, all sorts of technological solutions to helping us get things done on time. So I'm going to sort of explore that world and get those people to help me write my book on time.
Well, being on time, as I vaguely recall, was not one of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's great strengths. But we would love to hear you read about him for us, Leo.
Sorry. For this, I fear I will need reading glasses. It's kind of hard to read from a biography because it's a continuous story, and it's confusing to take it out of context. So I'll focus this evening on Rousseau's ideas, but also how his ideas were grounded in his life experience, which is one of the themes of his great autobiography, The Confessions. The critic Lionel Trilling once said, the author of the Discourses, which are works of Rousseau's, has more power over us because he's the subject of the Confessions. He is the man. He suffered. He was there. To begin with, Rousseau's influence has been so pervasive, it's hard to appreciate how influential, in particular, the Confessions was in the way I was just mentioning, in foregrounding childhood, in trying to understand how certain perplexingly haunting and strange early experiences might be the key to figuring out who he was. So in the first of the 2 or 3 passages I'm going to read, he was working as a servant for a noblewoman who was dying of cancer, and he was hoping he'd be remembered in her will. What occurred immediately after the Countess's death produced another of these unforgettable moments that imprinted themselves in Rousseau's memory. While the dead woman's belongings were being collected and sorted, he noticed a little silver ribbon that appealed to him, and he pilfered it. The ribbon was missed. The servant's belongings were searched, and it was found in his room. There followed a public inquisition in front of the whole household in which he was forced to give an explanation. After hesitating at first, he blurted out that a pretty young cook named Marion, toward whom he felt an attraction, had given him the ribbon. Marion was brought in, and Rousseau describes with bitter self-reproach what happened next. They showed her the ribbon. I accused her insolently. She was dumbfounded and said nothing. She threw me a glance that would have disarmed devils, but my barbarous heart resisted it. The poor girl began to cry and said only this, "Ah, Rousseau, I believed you were a good fellow. You're making me very unhappy, and yet I wouldn't want to be in your place." In the end, it was decided Marion was probably more likely to be guilty than Rousseau. They were both dismissed. Later on, though, he never learned anything further about her, but he was tortured by the fear that she never got another good job and might have come to a miserable end as a result of his impulsive action. And for 40 years, he says in the Confessions, he was so tormented by guilt, he was never able to tell the story to a single person. As for the theft itself, it's easy to imagine the anxiety and distress that prompted this inquisition. He had been abandoned by his family, had run away from his Geneva home. He was now about to lose his job in a foreign city. It was Turin in Italy, where he had no connections and no prospects. He was still just 16 years old. On top of all that, he was disappointed and hurt to receive nothing from the dying lady he admired, and it's not surprising that he privately helped himself to a little reward. Thieving was not unprecedented in his life. As an apprentice in Geneva, he'd grown accustomed to lying about it. What was shocking now was the terror of public shame in a noble household where he had enjoyed some favor, followed by the discovery he could brazenly accuse an innocent person and get away with it. Now, as critics have noticed, the story of the ribbon is a mirror image of an earlier story. And in that one, he was beaten as a child for breaking a comb, which in actuality he had never seen. That was a shocking revelation that appearances can make one look guilty even when innocent. Back then, Rousseau had been the accused innocent whose sincere defense was not believed. Now he was guilty, but his insincere defense was believed, or at least accepted. Interpreters have suggested psychoanalytic interpretations for what Rousseau did. It's certainly conceivable Marion had seemed unresponsive to him, and that unconscious aggression inspired him to accuse her. He himself saw the episode as an instance of the power of socially induced shame to overcome even the keenest feelings of guilt. He thought if only his master had taken him aside and questioned him in a kindly way, he would have confessed everything. But he found the accusing stares intolerable. He says in the Confessions, "The presence of everybody was stronger than my repentance. I didn't fear punishment much. I feared only shame, but I feared that more than death. I saw only the horror of being recognized, declared publicly to be a thief and a liar." All his life, Rousseau longed to be truly known, transparent, he liked to say, but that would be desirable only if he had nothing to hide. What if he were indeed a thief? Then it would be disastrous to be recognized, better not to be known. The heart of Rousseau's later thinking lies in this little incident, which no other writer of the time would have been likely to relate. To liberate an authentic self from socially induced hypocrisy would become his mission, and no one knew better than he how hard it would be to achieve it. Now I'll change gears and look at the first of Rousseau's great works. It's called The Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. It was published about 30 years after that episode of The Ribbon, but you'll see how episodes like that bear fruit. At this point, Rousseau was responding to a prize competition to explain how inequality developed in human society, and he proposed a dramatically new kind of interpretation. 100 years before Rousseau's time, the bleak moralists of the 17th century, living through scary wars and political crises, saw selfishness and cruelty as inseparable from human nature. The Catholic Pascal said, "All men naturally hate each other." And the secular writer La Rochefoucauld described selfishness as the mainspring of human behavior. He said, "Amour propre is love of oneself and of all things for oneself. It makes men idolaters of themselves and tyrants over others if fortune gives them the chance." Thomas Hobbes, who was appalled by a civil war in England, concluded even the most repressive government, even a tyranny, is preferable to an anarchic state of nature, in which he said there would be no arts, no letters, no society, worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. By the middle of the 18th century, attitudes like these were widely dismissed as outmoded relics. Enlightened self-interest was promoted as the key to happiness. It became common to claim benevolence, not selfishness, was instinctive in human beings, who were designed by nature to live in cooperative groups. Now, against this Enlightenment consensus, this 18th century view, Rousseau took a completely unexpected turn. La Rochefoucauld and Hobbes had been perfectly right about selfishness, he decided, but where they went wrong was assuming it's inherent in human nature. On the contrary, it was society that made men selfish and wicked. In a true state of nature, they would have been good. Or to put it more accurately, the very concepts of good and evil would have had no meaning then, for our earliest ancestors were solitary hunter-gatherers wandering through the primal forests with no need of other people. Far from being the solution to our problems, society was the problem. With no occasion to compete with others, much less to exploit them, natural man would lack this corrosive amour propre that measures itself against other people. He would have only what Rousseau called amour de soi, the simple instinct of self-preservation of a healthy animal. He would be incapable of knowing himself, but he wouldn't need to. He would simply be himself. Whereas modern man, struggling to conform to society's demands, searches in vain for self-knowledge. Natural man wouldn't even think. In a sentence that became notorious, Rousseau declared, "The state of reflection is a state contrary to nature. The man who meditates is a depraved animal." So, in short, natural man was natural because he wasn't yet man. And if the life of this proto-man, today we would call him a hominid, seems narrow and unsatisfying, that's because we've tasted the poison fruit of progress and we can never turn back. Hobbes saw man's life in the state of nature as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Rousseau's natural man was fortunate to be solitary. He had no standard by which to define life as poor and nasty. He neither knew nor cared that it was brutish and short. Natural man sometimes encountered other people, of course, and instinct impelled him to mate with natural woman. But for both of them, it would be a chance encounter, and they wouldn't care if they ever saw each other again. Who was that natural man? Sex was a simple and adequate relief, like sneezing, free from jealousy and possessiveness that underlie romantic love. Rousseau explicitly called that an artificial sentiment born of society. Likewise, mothers would nurse and care for their children, but here too the relationship would end as soon as the young ones could fend for themselves. It was usual in the 18th century to extol the family as the shaper of humanity and source of its consolations. In Rousseau's experience, and this is a biography, these came at a steep price: patriarchal authority, coercive demands for affection, Oedipal anxieties, and guilt. So what went wrong? Rousseau speculated, much as modern anthropologists still do, that as populations grew, people joined together to increase the food supply. Agriculture and metallurgy developed to meet the need. Once that happened, labor had to be organized and enforced. Some people got richer than others. Governments were established to protect their wealth. The many became subordinate to the few. The moment of transition, he says, crystallized when a man first enclosed a field and said, "Ceci est à moi," this belongs to me. Pascal said virtually the same thing a century earlier, but for Pascal, the tragic moralist, that reflects the sinfulness of human nature. Rousseau believed in the natural goodness of human nature, and he stood the idea on its head by defining it as a social and political problem. In this altogether new perspective, human beings were victims of their own social behavior, not of primal sin. Long before Rousseau, the ancient author Tacitus gave a similar picture of a lost golden age. According to Tacitus, primitive man had no evil desires, blameless and innocent. His life was free of compulsions or penalties. He also needed no rewards, for he was naturally good. But the classical golden age was a totally imaginary society. Shepherds sang to win the hearts of innocent maidens. The wisdom of elders was honored by the grateful young. Rousseau's insight was far more challenging. His thesis was competition and inequality are intrinsic to any society whatsoever. There could never be a golden age for beings who are anything like us. The crucial point was the things we most value carry the seeds of their own subversion. And in a wonderful sentence, he says, when communities were established with families at the center, the habit of living together gave birth to the sweetest emotions known to man, conjugal and paternal love, but people grew accustomed to gathering in front of their huts or around a big tree. Singing and dancing, true offspring of love and leisure, became the amusement of these gatherings of men and women. Each one began to look at the others and want to be looked at himself, and public esteem took on value. The one who sang or danced the best, the most handsome, the strongest, the most skillful, became the most esteemed, and this was the first step toward inequality. From these initial preferences were born, on the one hand, vanity and contempt, on the other hand, shame and envy. Well, in his own life, Rousseau smarted under the vanity and contempt of the great, and envy and shame, as in that stolen ribbon story, were the source of his deepest anguish. But to stress how unattractive this primitive existence would have been, which all the critics in his own day did, missed the point. Rousseau had read a lot in accounts of exploration. He understood that no human society on earth remained in that very natural state that he imagined. Every single one has language, it has government, it has wars, and all the rest of it. So he meant what he said. The state of nature was a thought experiment. He said, it no longer exists, perhaps it never did exist, probably never will, but you must have an accurate idea of it in order to judge our present state. It's a standpoint to think about what would we be like if our ideas and our values and our very feelings weren't shaped by society. And the rest of Rousseau's life was spent trying to figure out if there's an authentic self underneath all the layers of role-playing, and to try to imagine a political system and an educational program that might help to liberate that authentic self. This critique was incredibly far-reaching. It was perfectly common in his day to criticize particular kinds of inequity and to appeal for reforms. It was original to say inequality is unacceptable, but it's also inevitable. It was common to acknowledge labor could often be harsh. It was original to say that labor itself is a betrayal of our human nature. It was common to say we learn to see ourselves as others see us because we have to be integrated in society. It was original to say that we've somehow sold out our true selves when we do that. In his education treatise, Émile, Rousseau makes the point very clearly, as soon as you see through the eyes of others, you must will by their wills. You always say we want, and you always do what the others want. And if Rousseau's thinking was political, it was psychological too. Freud was Rousseau's heir when he said, the liberty of the individual is no gift of civilization. It was greatest before there was any civilization. And finally, I'll read just a short passage where I try to convey what these insights were like and also what some of their limitations are by comparing or contrasting Rousseau with a very famous contemporary. If Rousseau is the prophet of introspective analysis, we have other models of self-understanding too. Perhaps the most interesting contrast is with his contemporary Benjamin Franklin, who likewise wrote a famous autobiography. Franklin's book influenced generations of readers because it showed how a self-made man did the making. We remember Franklin as he wanted to be remembered, a tireless inventor and organizer in a world of projects and public works, founding fire departments and post offices and public libraries and universities, inventing the lightning rod and bifocal glasses and the Franklin stove. His inner life is another matter. A scholar who has studied every word Franklin wrote concludes, who can do more than guess about this man? But if Franklin wore a mask, it was one that fitted his face. He liked to imagine himself in a group identity. He was committed to politics as compromise among interest groups. That was the very thing that Rousseau's social contract argued against. Rousseau was a prophet, Franklin was a facilitator. Psychologically, Franklin embodies the ideal of being well adjusted. In the life story he tells about himself, he turns every setback around. He was born just 1 year after Rousseau. At the outset, had surprisingly similar experiences, a limited formal education, a hated apprenticeship from which he ran away. He says his master's tyranny gave him a lifelong aversion to arbitrary power. But Franklin was not interested, as Rousseau was, in the ways in which servitude could alter a person for the worse, as Rousseau experienced back then with the stolen ribbon, an insight that underlies that discourse on inequality. And indeed, Rousseau had become an idler and a petty thief. He ran away from home at 16 with no idea what to do next. He drifted aimlessly for the next 10 years. Franklin ran away from Boston at 17 with plenty of self-discipline and skills, set himself up as a printer in Philadelphia, and immediately became a watchword for industriousness and honesty. To build up the kind of stable character that 18th century society admired, the best means was to condition oneself to act in the desired ways. Franklin figured this out very early. At the age of 19, he drew up a plan of conduct to accomplish it. He realized he'd begun to strike people as an assertive, free thinker, and he was given to outbursts of anger that alienated them. So he set out to delete the undesirable tendencies and acquire the correct ones. He made a chart of 13 virtues and attacked them systematically, 1 virtue per week, 4 cycles per year. This was a behaviorist experiment with himself as subject, and the contrast with Rousseau could not be more marked. Rousseau wanted to recover his true self by getting rid of the habits that social life called for, whereas they were exactly what Franklin wanted to acquire. Franklin showed he was able to learn from his mistakes and correct them. Rousseau showed that mistakes form a pattern full of meaning for self-understanding. It's no exaggeration to say Franklin and Rousseau stand at opposite poles of the legacy we've inherited from the 18th century. Contemporary American culture talks the Rousseau line, but lives the Franklin life. When we talk about getting in touch with our true selves, or being what we were meant to be, we're talking like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. When we commit ourselves to careers, or strive to be team players, we're living like Benjamin Franklin. To say it another way, Franklin's autobiography encourages readers to construct a public life. Rousseau's Confessions challenges them to make a journey into the self. These are fundamental tensions in modern life, and their first great analyst was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Thank you.
Well, thank you to our guests and President Joliker for a most engaging evening. You're invited to a reception at the Ylvisaker Library where authors will be available to sign their books and where we will continue our conversation. Tomorrow morning at 9:20 here in the Centrum, we will hold the opening convocation for the Celebration of Excellence, and we'll again hear from Alan Burdick and Leo Damrosch. Please join me once again to conclude the evening by thanking our visitors.